welcome everyone to the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society's Research and Practice seminar series. My name is Dr. Renee Fomiati and I'm a Research Officer at ARCSHS. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respect to their elders past and present. So today at our seminar we have a very special guest. We have Associate Professor Graham Brown talking about researching peer-led responses. Just to give you the heads up about how we're going to run this, Graham is going to be speaking for about 40 minutes, followed by some time for questions afterwards. Just to mention, Professor Suzanne Fraser, the Director of ARCHES, was meant to be here today to introduce Graham, but is no longer able to attend due to a family matter. She wanted to send her apologies and say how much she really wanted to be here to hear you speak, Graham. But in her absence, we're very lucky to be joined by Associate Professor Adam Bourne, who is the Deputy Director of ARCHES. I'm now going to hand over to Adam to introduce Graham.
Thanks, Renee. And while it's very sad that Suzanne wasn't able to make it, it is with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce Graham for this webinar. I've only been at ARCHES for the last 3.5 years, but I've known Graham for more than a decade. He and I met at an MSM Global Forum conference in Vienna back in 2010 and found ourselves amidst a ragtag bag of HIV activists who came together from across the world to try to reinforce the HIV prevention effort among MSM. And Graham and I have enjoyed each other's company, having a beer at many conferences all around the world in the intervening years since. It was actually Graham who forwarded me the job that I now hold at ARCHES when it came up a few years ago, and working with him has been an absolute pleasure over the last few years. What are Graham's strengths? What are the things we really, as his colleagues at the centre, what do we really celebrate about him? Well, firstly, I think it is his sense of the academic rigour of his work, the ways in which he applies very complex theories, particularly around systems thinking, in really innovative and nuanced ways. And in ways that are really unique within the HIV response. Also his rigour in relation to both qualitative and quantitative methods are very well regarded within the field. Secondly, Graham he's collegial, he's respectful, and he's a team player. And I know those things might sound a little glib, but they really matter. They really matter in a research centre which prides itself on interdisciplinary research, which prides itself on team-based projects where we support one another with our relative skills and experience. And Graham is always someone who is willing to step up and help out, to lend his expertise, to offer a word of wisdom or be a sounding board when you're struggling to wrap your head around a particular concept. But most of all, and I think the thing that Graham will always want to be remembered for by everyone, is his commitment to the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and of other marginalized communities. Nothing about Graham's work is tokenistic. In no way is it, oh, we'll establish a community board over here and I'll stick a few people on them and I'll speak to them once or twice a year. Nothing about Graham's work even approaches that. Like he is embedded within communities. He sits alongside them, trying to understand the work that they do, to evidence the work that they do, to help inform the HIV response among those communities who are most impacted. And this value set that Graham holds is what has informed his many years of work examining the role of peers in the HIV response. And I know he's really strived to provide an essential evidence base to demonstrate the role, the impact of peer-led interventions and responses so that they can be understood, so that they can be recognized, and so that they can be sufficiently resourced within the wider HIV systems. Peers play such an essential role that is often overlooked and that isn't, in some contexts, isn't valued. But Graham has done such an awful lot of work globally to try and help counter that, to try and help demonstrate what an essential part that they play. We are, as a centre, deeply saddened to see Graham go. He's been really integral for ARCSHS for more than a decade, and particularly in the last few years has played a fantastic role in leading our social responses to HIV and other bloodborne viruses programme. We do, however, look forward to many more years of productive collaboration with Graham, and I'm sure he will do a tremendous job at the University of New South Wales and will continue his good work in HIV, as well as expanding that into other fields and other health issues as well, perhaps in the future. It is with great pleasure that I hand over to Graham for his reflections on 20 years of collaboration, advocacy, and creating change.
Thank you, Adam. That was lovely. I really appreciate all those kind words, and yeah, so it's just recognition of the work that we've all been doing together. I shall share my screen and we can start. It's quite a privilege to be here today. I really, really do appreciate it. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge this presentation is being seen across many other lands in Australia, and so I also pay my respects to elders across those lands. Today I have the privilege of, Today I've got the privilege of reflecting on 20 years of collaboration with community and peer-led organisations. And so in light of that, I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of community to that research and to the whole response. People living with HIV and hepatitis C and many other communities that I've worked with have been a core part of Australia and the international response to HIV and hepatitis C. We owe a lot to the contributions and the global response owes a debt to the courage, strength and determination of these communities. What I'm going to talk about first is I'll just touch on COVID-19 and then into the experiences I've had. Responses to viral pandemics are regularly medicalised, criminalised and stigmatised, when viruses by their very nature are social and community-based. Viruses may not discriminate, but we're in a world where transmission is highly discriminatory. We only need to look at the recent data from Melbourne with COVID-19, showing how the most disadvantaged suburbs are massively overrepresented. Scratch the surface here and we see a mix of insecure employment and housing, gender inequality, racism, and structural neglect. These are systemic issues that not only enable enable an epidemic, but also sustains an environment in which mobilised community responses have to work so much harder for so much longer. It's with this idea of systemic barriers and enablers in mind that I'd like to reflect on my own experiences with community-led response with HIV and hepatitis C. As Adam was saying, peer-led responses, community mobilisation, advocacy and health promotion have been central characteristic of Australia's response to HIV and Hep C. In fact, the first guiding principle of the HIV and Hep C strategies in Australia is the meaningful involvement of priority populations. Now, I'm going to use the term peer organisation and peer response, but I mean that in a very broad sense to mean both community-based organisations, peer-led organisations and networks. Peer organisations have continuously adapted with their communities to improve health, well-being and the rights of communities. Their ability to simultaneously engage with community and policy systems and be nimble and flexible in responding to very politically volatile environments has been a hallmark of these organisations. And it's this knowledge, experience and insights that underpins the collaboration between peer organisations and researchers. However, peer involvement in research, be it clinical, social, health services, evaluation or implementation research, is often limited to consultation, recruitment and reporting back. These are important, but the discussion has generally been limited to the methodology and good practice rather than looking at the broader system and structural level factors. So today I'd like to take you on a little bit of a journey through my research collaborations. I'll draw on my early experience in peer and community mobilisation at the WHO/AIDS Council, and then my research collaborations at Curtin Centre for Health Promotion Research, and also at ARCSHS here at La Trobe. However, I do promise I will not be presenting any complex system maps or any heavy statistics or any high theory. I also warn you, there are some old photos, and I realise how few photos I have of me that are work-related where I'm not actually at a conference. But let's start. So, when I became first involved in HIV, it was actually less to do with HIV and more as a peer advocate for young people and doing peer outreach. At 23, I was part of the group that established the Freedom Centre, Australia's first peer-led centre for same-sex attracted and gender diverse young people. When I was diagnosed with HIV at 25, reaching the age of 40, which seemed a long way off, reaching the age of 40 was considered very unlikely. And tomorrow I turned 50. So my work with the Freedom Centre was also an introduction to the gaps in evidence to advocate for our work and how some research issues were systematically avoided or ignored by policy and funding. It was at WAC that, I suppose, embedded in me the understanding of the role of a peer perspective in making evidence, interpreting evidence, navigating evidence, and advocating for evidence. My time at WAC also provided me with insights on some of the personal challenges of researching your own community as a peer. The personal challenges of the research content, the simultaneous insights and biases, especially when the evidence was different to what you believed to be true and perhaps that peer program wasn't as effective as you hoped. Or at 2 AM on a podium at Connections nightclub and suddenly someone is correcting my statistics. In time, I became manager of the peer programs at WAC, working with people living with HIV, communities of gay and bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and young people. And I did present a number of times at a number of national conferences and policy settings on my frustration that research was too distal from on-the-ground practice. I was also frustrated at the limited evaluation within our programs that made us really vulnerable. In an effort to ensure WA had local data, I do recall in my 20s convincing the WA Department of Health to let the AIDS Council do the Gay Community Periodic Survey itself, rather than the national centres, as I was confident we could do it for the very limited funding that was available. This was actually my introduction to national research centres, where my name was associated with difficulties of nationally coordinated research agenda. I think the phrase that came back to us was, "This Graham Brown is trying to ruin everything." I helped things enormously by responding to the national centres saying, "Oh, over East, is there a research agenda?" So my beginnings with collaboration with researchers was off to a really great start. But the reality is the huge and unfunded support I received for that study in Perth from the now Centre for Social Research and Health, Kirby Institute, ARCSHS and Burnett was huge. It made the fledgling Perth Gay Community Periodic Survey possible. The practical free support that research funds and infrastructure today really are no longer able to support, which I'll come back to later. But what we saw emerging across Australia was community and research creating change together, and a community that held that HIV research and Hep C research to a very high bar. Despite that, while I was at WAC, I continued to complain about research, so much so that my colleagues at WAC convinced me to stop whining and go and do something about it. So I joined what was then the WA Centre for Health Promotion Research at Curtin University. I had the opportunity to expand my work to other community and peer-led programs led by young people. This included migrant young people, Aboriginal young people, rural, as well as LGBTQ young people, and expand my topics into mental health promotion, sexual health, drug use, marginalisation, and social connection. It was here that my colleagues and I collaborated with a range of community organisations to develop what we refer to as My Peer, a broad program where we started to expand the understanding of what is useful evaluation and evidence for peer-led programs. We also collaborated with AFAO and a number of AIDS councils to look at, to do some of the first research into peer outreach in online chat rooms. Yes, chat rooms. Remember them? Curtin enabled me to have some incredible opportunities to maintain my research, my advocacy, and my connection with communities, and supported me to take on the role of the president of AFAO, the first West Australian to do so. I also saw the value of recruiting more and more people from community sector and peer organisations into these research programs. So much so that I was actually advised by WAC that I could not speak to staff any further unsupervised, as they kept ending up being poached by my research centre to work with me. I absolutely stopped doing that at ARCSHS, except for Kylie, Daniel, Tim, Patrina, and a few others. But when I did move to ARCSHS, I was still navigating that sort of community advocate research divide. I do recall my first day at ARCSHS, close to 10 years ago, the director, Marion Pitts, had a letter from the president of FAO, me, strongly criticising the research priorities of the national centres. That was my first item on my first supervision meeting with my new director. But the reality was there was enough history, trust and respect between FAO and the community sector and the research centres that these sorts of discussions and debates could happen openly and assertively and did lead to better outcomes. At ARCSHS, I had the privilege to focus on the theory, practice and evaluation of peer-led responses, and over time this came to be known as the What Works and Why, or W3 project. W3 was about finding a new way to describe the full role of peer-led response and supporting that response to build its own useful evidence. This was when we took our collaborations from across Australia on what actually became a 5-year journey into complex adaptive systems. This was a huge undertaking requiring high levels of trust and commitment from my collaborators. The W3 project required peer staff and researchers to take simultaneous roles of driving the research, participants, analysts, and advocates. And organisations were willing to go on that journey without a clear result in sight. There's plenty of published and presented details on the outcomes of W3 so far, and a new W3 guide and website's underway. In the next stage, we'll be pooling resources and data, aiming to build the first nationally consolidated evidence base on selected peer programs. The momentum of W3 also enabled community, clinical and research collaboration that resulted in POSQUAL, the quality of life scale for people with HIV for use in day-to-day health and community services. And that collaborations now result in a scale that's an indicator for the national strategy, being used across community and clinical settings and translated into 11 languages. Through my work at ARCSHS, I've been afforded amazing opportunities to collaborate with and advocate for community-led responses across Australia and internationally. But also with that opportunities, I've been able to draw on and learn a whole range of lessons. So over those 20 years with my many collaborators and colleagues, I've come to an understanding of collaboration in research and the benefits, barriers and enablers, and I'd like to share some thoughts on those. First, let's have in mind some of the benefits of true, genuine collaboration between research and community. I'm not going to summarise the evidence of how collaborative research enhances the outcomes of projects, ensuring they're accurate, relevant, meaningful and persuasive. That's well described elsewhere. What I have found is that investing in sustained collaboration strengthens both peer organisations and research centres. For peer organisations, collaboration across organisations, what I've found is peer staff have increased their confidence and trust in collaborating, negotiating and pushing back with researchers, and are better equipped to influence the broader research agenda. The key here is the influence on research is broadened beyond senior peer staff to all peer workers, building their own peer leadership and influence. Having a range of peer advocates confident in their own voice on research strengthens the peer response's capacity to ensure that that research is effective. For research centres, investing in sustained collaboration demonstrates the credibility and authenticity within the community sector and their communities. This strengthens the research centre's other work, such as insights for research priorities, engagement with community participants, endorsement of study results, and advocating for research investment. The engagement and ownership of collaborating organisations was key to the funding of W3 and POSQUAL. Our collaborators can often advocate for research far more convincingly than researchers. There are, however, 3 barriers I'd like to touch base on. First of all, the funding of peer organisations can often be quite misaligned with the commitments they're trying to make. The peer-led response is embedded in the communities they participate with and the policy and research environment which they operate and collaborate. Navigating this complex policy and research system is a key component for peer organisations' own influence. However, the system level influence is generally not part of their service program or funding. For example, maintaining a strong pool of influential peers and volunteers is essential for peer organisations to engage with their communities. Less recognised is that these peers are also crucial to effective long-term partnerships and essential to any sort of meaningful participation in research. Peer leadership does not neatly fit into activity-based funding models. There's a risk that building capacity in research may sometimes be interpreted as advocacy, which many funding agreements explicitly and mistakenly prohibit. While this is not a new challenge, the impact on sustaining meaningful involvement in research is less recognised. When government funding reduces the capacity and influence of peer leadership, it's undermining its own investment in effective, trusted, and timely research. And COVID-19 has shown how hard it is to scale up community relationships and research quickly. The next one is around peer leadership drawing on communities. A strength of peer organisations is their participation within their communities, including the tensions and challenges. However, this adds another layer of complexity. Peer staff are drawn from communities under pressure from marginalisation, discriminalisation, criminalisation and racism. Many of these communities have higher rates of health complications, mental health challenges, and interaction with the legal and justice system. Peer organisations have demonstrated incredible resilience and innovation. However, these experiences impact on the amount of flexibility, time, and energy. Co-design and action research takes significant resources, and there's an emotional cost to playing the triple role of being a collaborator, facilitator, and a subject of research. It takes resilience to overcome reluctance to invest all those limited resources into research when past experiences may have been tokenistic, stigmatizing, or even just the effort of having to orient and acclimatize each new researcher. Identifying and then selecting which research is both trustworthy and worth the opportunity cost takes time. When a community organisation promotes a poor study to their community, it's the community organisation that bears the most brunt and reputational risk. I think the research review panels such as at Thorn Harbour and ACON are a really important role in managing this. Whoops. I've jumped a bit. Sorry. The last one I want to touch base on is the investment of time and resources doesn't guarantee benefits. For peer organisations, the benefits of investing in research are often not immediately visible or demonstrable. The promise of future benefits needs to be balanced against the need for visible short-term outcomes demanded by both communities and funders. What I mean by this is, for example, the short-term benefits of the W3 project were not uniformly experienced across the organisations. Stage 1, we had 10 peer organisations working with us to develop the W3 framework. However, in stage 2, we only had the resources to work with 2 peer organisations on applying that framework. The long-term benefits of the W3 project for the broader peer sector are only now emerging and yet to be fully achieved, some years after those organisations first participated. In terms of for research institutions, meaningful participation may be viewed as adding an additional layer of time and resources to research. In the short term, meaningful collaboration can mean a focus on tailored outputs such as community reports and briefings, or commitments to the sector, such as presentations, workshops, and training about applying the results. This can result in delays in outputs that are more valued by academia. For example, W3 project's methodology, with an emphasis on participation and reflexive practice-based outcomes, limited the project's capacity to translate that research quickly into peer-reviewed journal papers. The broader structures that drive research funding don't necessarily place the same value on the time and resources required to maintain long-term collaboration and ownership. The resources that enabled the HIV research centres to mentor and support me and lead studies in WA back when I was in my 20s and 30s are greatly diminished. They're no longer part of most research investments. Research centres are more stretched than ever, and the short-term funding and increased casualised workforce of universities undermines sustaining long-term relationships. I am very concerned that these sorts of pressures will be increased significantly over coming years around the impact, because of the impact of COVID-19 on universities and research investment generally. However, let's think it more positive. I think there are actions we can pursue to counter these sorts of barriers and build an environment that enables community and research partnerships to continue to thrive. I'd like to share just 3 of these. The first one is around the demonstration of two-way trust and commitment. The establishment and maintenance of trust and commitment in a research collaboration is crucial for a study to remain flexible. In studies like W3, as well as the Peer Insights project with people who use drugs, or the POSQUAL study with people living with HIV, the researchers trusted the expertise, experience, and perspective of peer staff, while the peer staff trusted the commitment and authenticity of the research team. This included the researchers sharing ownership of the research direction, the analysis, and the outcomes, demonstrating an environment where ideas could be openly discussed and challenged meant peer staff didn't have to overcome a unified view of researchers, or vice versa. All were part of forming a shared view from the beginning. This doesn't happen overnight. This trust and commitment needs to be beyond the life of any single project, and needs to be enabled, reinforced, and demonstrated at an organisational level, not just at an individual researcher or individual peer staff level. Another one I'd like to talk around is about the visibility. Insights from peer organisations are often a source of real-time knowledge about emerging community issues and so forth. Peer organisations are very aware of the power differences in the voice and opinions across policy, health service, and community sectors. In the W3 project, we showed that for peer organisations to have meaningful influence in research and policy, yes, they need to have deep engagement with their communities, they need partnership across the sector, and sophisticated analysis of emerging issues. But they also need an environment that values their insights. This requires allies across the research, policy, and health services to not just collaborate and share knowledge back and forth, but allies who visibly and vocally value, believe, and act on those peer insights and advice. Our communities have achieved great things by being at the table. However, significant advocacy is required to maintain the expertise from gay men, gay bisexual men, people with HIV and hepatitis C, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, sex workers, people who use drugs, and migrant communities at the table. And that table is not equal across those groups. We found in W3 that relationships, partnerships, and alliances that are visible and vocal enhance the recognition of the peer voice and can challenge institutionalized stigma. The last one I'd like to talk about is around flexibility in funding. The W3 project was funded by the Australian Commonwealth Department of Health as part of strategic investments in the national strategies. The nature of the fund allowed significant flexibility to incorporate meaningful participation and make a multi-year commitment to our collaborators. This sort of funding shouldn't be viewed as a privileged, fortunate, or rare, but it should be viewed as good practice. To achieve this flexibility and adaptability in research, funding requires advocacy. Something that can often be underestimated is the influence of research and community advocating together. The role and influence of the community sector in Australia to advocate for targeted and effective research investment and policy is often underestimated, particularly within broader university structures. And I think we need to value this reciprocal goal far more strategically. I started with some comments regarding COVID-19. While our community and peer-led response and our research response are under significant pressure, we should also reflect on how quickly we're able to adapt and adapt confidently. Why is it that the community response born out of HIV and Hep C has been one of the areas to respond and adapt and be influential so quickly with COVID-19? Is it the pre-existing relationships across community health systems, research and policy? Was it the willingness to not just listen, but to trust, or at least be convinced that community knew what it was doing? A preparedness for the unexpected and the connections and confidence and audacity to take action, but also to have that action supported and trusted? Or was it the understanding that to rapidly scale up a community response, you need to have already invested in community trust, relationships, and infrastructure sometime before? These are all elements that underpin our current strengths in the Australian response to HIV and Hep C, and COVID has shown how important and vulnerable they can be. We often talk about partnerships and collaboration frameworks, and I'm starting to rethink these a bit. In research fields, often being an ally is seen as the culmination, the goal. It's certainly better than the alternatives, which you might consider to be acceptance, acknowledgement, or even avoidance. However, I would argue ally is really the minimum, the starting point. If I've learnt anything, that what we really need in today's climate is more than allies. If we're in this together, then we need fellow advocates, accomplices, or a preparedness to be a whole lot more audacious. Collaborations of research and community are more than good evidence-based methodological decisions. Collaborations are a political decision grounded in human rights, principles, and transformative. And we should not shy away from this. A political decision and an evidence-based decision can be the same thing. And in today's climate, collaboration and evidence is political. In October, I start a new chapter as I move to the Centre for Social Impact. And I'm really looking forward to maintaining many of my collaborations and friendships I've built and starting new adventures and hopefully being more audacious. I started to actually make a thank you list and it suddenly got to over 50 people, so that wasn't going to work. So I'd like to thank the many people and institutions who have not just supported me, but supported what we've all been working towards. I'd like to thank the community and peer organisations in Australia and elsewhere who trusted me and collaborated in the studies and even advocated for me. I'd like to thank the funders and investors who saw the value in what we put forward, even when we were uncertain. I'd like to thank the community members who participated and trusted the endorsement of their own peer organisations to participate within our studies. I'd also like to thank the one person who was there when the journey first started and even before, who's been there throughout my highs and lows, frustrations and joys, and my very blurred work-life boundaries. My husband, David. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Graham. That made me feel a bit emotional at the end, and I've only worked with you for the last little while. I can already see that there's a couple of questions and there were also some hands up during your talk. I think I've lost there. I think Daniel, you had your hand up. I'm just going to allow you to talk if you still want to ask your question. Are you there, Daniel?
I am, but that must have been a mistake. Thanks, Graham, though, for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, who is a great ally and colleague with W3 Project.
I can also see, so I'd encourage everyone, if you've got a question or even if you've got any reflections or, you know, in the absence of being able to go to the pub or a bar afterwards and drink multiple bottles of champagne. If anyone would like to just reflect also on working with Graham, this is a bit of a special event. So if you'd like to say anything, just put up your hand virtually and I'll turn on the your mic for you. Or if you'd prefer to write a question, you can write it in and I'll do my best to read it out. So David has just, can you see these, Graham? David has written and said,
Oh, yep.
What challenges have you found in dealing with research across Australia and HIV? Are there differences based on jurisdiction, for example, WA versus the Northern Territory and New South Wales?
Okay, thanks. So that's a good question. I suppose I've been through quite a lot of journeys with that. One of the things that I certainly found navigating research and so forth was, for the first few years when I came over from WA, not being part of the, should we say, not being from the East Coast and not being part of the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry, actually enabled me to navigate that somewhat easier, and being able to call out things that really perhaps needed to move forward and be less about particular programs or particular organisations. So on the political side, I think that can often be underestimated, the sort of issues of I suppose just navigating what evidence is and what evidence means in very different jurisdictions and so forth. In terms of research across areas, one of the big challenges I found, being from WA, many people will be aware of the research that myself and colleagues at Curtin have been doing for many years around overseas acquired HIV and so forth. One of the challenges that we had was trying to mobilise energy around migrant communities, around overseas acquired HIV and those areas, when the data tended to mask that quite a lot. And so on the East Coast, shall we say, clearly the locally acquired HIV was a major issue and was dominating the data, but we could see it emerging. It can actually take a long time. And one of the things that worked most effectively in doing research within each of the different states was drawing states together. So once we had WA, South Australia, Queensland all working together and Northern Territory working together around some of these issues, I think that's when we really got some momentum. So cross-jurisdictional collaborations are probably the stronger aspect of getting real mobilised or real effect happening within each state.
You're getting a stream of love on the comments. Can't possibly read them all out, but they're basically all saying you're wonderful and sorely missed and everyone loves you. But there are a few people that have their hands up to either say that or ask more questions. So I can see Nathaniel Wells. I'm just going to allow you to talk. Nathaniel? Not there?
No, yes, I'm here. Sorry, I had myself on mute. Thanks, Graham. That was an amazing presentation. And I guess one thing, as you were talking about COVID, I couldn't help but think about the response to the Flemington Towers in Melbourne and how, you know, there's so many called organisations that work with called groups and refugees, and yet the Flemington Towers went ahead with that huge sort of police presence and that really fast lockdown. And I would like to think, or I imagine, that if it had have happened to sort of a middle class, gay, male, white group of people, there would have been huge outrage. And I'm wondering whether you had any thoughts on sort of why or how sort of that group of people in those towers could have had that response, and sort of, you know, what is there any difference in terms of the peer organisations, in terms of the advocacy that those groups sort of do and the power that those groups have? Thanks,
Nathan. I really appreciate that. And that's an excellent question and does speak quite directly to some of the issues I was raising. I'd also like to note Chris Lemo's public question on a similar aspect, which parallels Nathaniel's question around. Chris Lemo said, how can we present an argument for a major investment in meaningful involvement of community in the COVID-19 response in the next few weeks? So there's two aspects there. The first thing I'd say is, on one level, it is difficult for me to to really know how to achieve that as a white, cisgender, middle-aged gay man. I am very, very aware, for example, in a lot of the national committees and responses, even within HIV and Hep C, when we're actually advocating, we have the different priority groups at the table. Some of the groups at that table, for example, white gay men, don't have to always justify why we're there every time we're at the meeting. Other parts of our communities and allies, in particular across around a whole range of migrant areas, sex workers, people who use drugs and so forth, don't have the same level of privilege. There is different levels of privilege even within the tables that we're all sitting at. What I would say is that is where being vocal and visible comes in. Around other parts of the community need to be standing up and saying, we're not going to progress unless these people are in front and are leading. So for example, I think there was a lot of advocacy that I saw from cultural and multicultural groups and organisations and health services, particularly around that with the towers and so forth. The concern I had was that from an outsider's view, it just didn't feel like they were being heard in a way that was trusted. That's probably the wrong word. Heard in a way that was actually overcoming the other sorts of voices that I think government was hearing, particularly around the sort of almost criminalised response and the policing response and so forth. One of the things I think we need to perhaps do is forming better coalitions across health and welfare issues. So it's less about any particular issue, but more about the active and critical role of community to actually be leading and to demonstrate more of where, when you trust community, that it knows what it's doing and that the insights are valid and real time, that we actually get better responses. In relation to Chris's point that builds on, perhaps that's, I'm just thinking that perhaps there's an aspect there of us pushing of where, highlighting where a deep engagement and understanding and trust and belief in community has resulted in better outcomes, and saying that we need to do that and we need to do it now if we're going to achieve those sorts of results.
Okay. I can see we've got a few more hands up. Anam, I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm just pressing the allow to talk button if you'd like to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Graham. You got me in tears just listening to you. I've been in the sector I work in South Australia in the HIV and viral hepatitis with multicultural community. And you really got me in tears because every single point you spoke about, it's been my struggle all my life. It's not that they don't trust us. I think what we are talking about is the subconscious biases, that if there is no research, we're not valid. Our opinion is not really that important unless there is a piece of information, which you are helping to establish. And I get to hear many people say, you told us this. And oh, wow, you know, and I wonder why I didn't listen to you. You know, things like that is, you know, and the COVID-19 is a great example of how we are also using our subconscious biases that, you know, now we have a case of multicultural community. They're not listening. They don't follow the rules. They don't understand our legal system and our protocols, and therefore we need to force it. And because they're assumed that having translated material is going to do the job, which is the tokenistic thing you spoke about. And I could go on and on and on. I just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you very, very much for leading this conversation and bringing it to the open, because it's so much needed to happen. And talking about, you know, I'm often find myself in around the table, but I don't think my views are always taken seriously or validated or even listened to it with curiosity. Now, why you think this way? you know, because they only see me as a manager, not as a person who is peer as well in the multicultural context. And I can go on and on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I really, really appreciate that. And I think you're right. I mean, I sometimes think the term trust is too blunt and loses nuance. And I think some of the points you raised are very much true. There are significant gaps within the research, but I think we also need to recognise that evidence alone is not and never has been enough. I was very, you know, when I was young, I just thought if we just knew enough and could just prove enough, then, you know, we'd get things through. That's part of it. And there are gaps we absolutely need to fill. But by itself, evidence doesn't achieve a lot. What we actually need then is multiple voices advocating that evidence and multiple voices acknowledging that community knowledge is evidence. And I think if we can mobilise that and look at that on par with the many other forms of evidence we draw on, then I think we'll be able to move ahead more effectively. Thanks, Enam. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We now have a question from Daryl O'Donnell. I'm just turning on your mic, Daryl.
Thank you. Graham, thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you for everything you've done over the last 20 years and will actually continue to do into the future. I'm really struck by all the comments that have flown through in the chat, and I was reflecting on just how pressured the life of an academic is, unbelievably pressured, and how painstaking the work is to actually build the kinds of relationships that you have with so many people and so many organisations over such a long period of time. So thank you. When I was thinking about the kinds of research you've led, Graham, I was really reflecting on, I was struck by the fact that a lot of what you've done has been to look at not what's wrong with us, but what's right with us in communities. And by that I mean looking at the ways in which as communities we've worked together and mobilised and tried to find ways of supporting each other as we navigate our way through the epidemics, and muddled through, not always perfectly, and you've really worked very hard to try and find language and frameworks and build the evidence of why that's so important and powerful. Graham, my question to you is, you know, you're an academic, you're a researcher, and I was wondering if you had any reflections on whether there's been a cost or perhaps even a value in the kind of very close relationships and collaboration that you've sought to have with community. And what I mean by that is, you know, there's an imperative for academics to operate independently, to sort of critically, to have that critical and dare I say, objective gaze on the work that they lead. I wonder how you've experienced that over the last 20 years in terms of the partnerships and collaborations you've formed. Have you sensed that you're, you know, is there a suspicion of that among your research colleagues or more widely in academia, and how have you overcome that?
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for your comments. I really appreciate that, and what an excellent question. It is something that I've thought a lot about, and in different ways at different times. I suppose one of the things I put forward is I feel, to an extent even today within research, there's a sense that a peer researcher, of which I very much see myself within certain peer contexts, but I'm not a peer across all the areas that I research. But a peer researcher, as I said before, is there are biases and there are insights. What I find sometimes is in research that the biases and insights of other perspectives are less recognised, particularly, say, some of the bias aspects. Looking at a research study, the results and so forth, from a purely objective point of view, if that's a term to use, I have found regularly misses so much of the understanding, the interpretation and the implications that a peer lens can actually give to research. And so I would argue that there are, you know, for other researchers and people and peer workers and peers who are thinking of doing studies and pursuing an area of really trying to like you said, understand better the things that are right with our communities and the successes that we're having so that we can maintain them. There is a challenge there of navigating the kinds of politics and biases that are not recognised as biases within academia. All I can say is I get it. Some of that certainly impacts on me, but I'll be blunt. As a middle-aged white male, I don't receive it as much as many of my colleagues of other genders, cultures, and backgrounds. I have seen others be challenged by it far more than I have been. The other part that I think is challenging of navigating, I suppose, that balance of what I've tried to do is maintain, I suppose, the insights that I understand as a peer and bring that with me to my research. What comes with that is also a commitment to community, to relationships and collaborations. That has an impact on the sort of research that I do, but it also has an impact on what I prioritise. Yeah, I don't want to go too hard, but let's just say there are many different priorities across the university sector, across the research sector, and across the policy sector, and not everything can be a priority. I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, Daryl, but I'm avoiding a few things.
Daryl's muted, so I don't know now.
Yep.
I'll continue. There was a question via the chat function from an anonymous attendee. As a researcher within AOD, alcohol and other drugs, what are some first steps researchers can do to begin to introduce consumer engagement or co-design into research?
Look, I suppose one of the things I would say, which actually reflects back to Daryl's point around, the strengths of communities, and he was saying how, communities have sort of muddled our way through. And I like to, the other words I would use would be iterative and responsive than muddled. I blundered in a number of environments when I first started getting involved with research. One of the advantages was coming from a HIV perspective. And as I said, working in a community-based organisation that was holding research to a very high bar. So I came in assuming that standard practice in research was genuine, meaningful involvement of community. Having that as an assumption was actually a bit of an advantage. I didn't go in thinking I was going to have to defend it. I went in assuming that was how it would happen. By doing that, I very quickly found allies and others who thought exactly the same way, and always presented it as this is ethically appropriate, methodologically sound, and evidence-based research, and arguing that there are many strategies that are put under the idea of being objective that are actually just exclusionary. There's objective research in its purest sense, and that's good, but there are many things that people call being objective and unbiased that's actually excluding quality, insight, and research. So I'm waffling there a bit, but I would say go in on the assumption that what you're actually wanting to do is evidence-based research, and it just happens to be collaborative and involving, meaningful involvement.
Thanks, Graham. I can see that Neil Fraser has raised their hand. I'm just going to allow them to talk.
There we go, I've got to unmute myself. Thanks, Graham. That was a really great presentation. So much of your research focuses, sorry, not so much your research, but other researchers focus on HIV prevention at the expense of the dignity of people like myself living with HIV, who inevitably are positioned as the vectors of disease, further fueling stigma. You have navigated this exceptionally well, and your focus on quality of life helps position us on an equal playing field. What do you think is at the core for your success in this space?
Thank you, Neil. And I appreciate the the premise of the question that I've been successful. So I love that. So thank you. Look, I think POSQual, for those who are unfamiliar, POSQual is a short scale we developed to understand and measure quality of life with people with HIV. And where that came from was very much tapping into the points that Neil's just mentioned, and that Daryl and others have referred to. What we needed to be able to do for our peer programs was show that what the peer programs were actually achieving was improving broader quality of life, and beyond what a lot of times the programs were funded to do. A lot of programs are funded on the basis of, education, increase knowledge, increase this, increase that, purely because they're the things that we can measure, not because that's the reason for the program. And so what a lot of POSQual and a lot of our work has been doing, I suppose, is looking to what are we actually trying to achieve? And let's put the effort in and work out how we can demonstrate and show that. When we start to do that, then we start to show the significant impact community mobilisation peer programs have with people with HIV, but we also start to show the significant influence that people living with HIV have had in the whole HIV response, the same way as people use drugs and people living with hepatitis C have had in the Hep C response, and across all of those areas. When we can actually, I suppose, demonstrate things on our own terms, then we start to have, I suppose, change the dynamic. One of the other things I think particularly around people with HIV we've been able to have is the idea that people, the centrality of the people with HIV in affected communities and the HIV response. The advocacy behind that has been to, I suppose, constantly show what that actually means and to resist that first principle of the national strategies just becoming a preamble, throwaway line in the beginning of the strategies. What I think I've been trying to do, and we still need to do, is to demonstrate how that principle makes the response better and makes the response effective. So that's very much around the role of people with HIV, not just in terms of prevention, but the critical need of people with HIV, increasing quality of life, increasing strength, increases their voice, increases their role in the broader community, which strengthens the entire response. I'm not sure if that quite answered it.
Great answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're now up to 4:59, so I think we better leave it there. I mean, Graham, thank you so much for today. I don't know if there's some way for us to collect the thread of comments that were just coming up there. I might try before I end this, but thank you so much for today and for your reflections on researching and collaborating with peer organisations. Do you have anything final you'd like to say before we sign off?
Look, just thank you everyone for tuning in. This far into an epidemic with this many webinars and this many Zoom meetings, and we've still had so many people prepared to tune in at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. I was so pleased. The key thing I'd also like to say is I'm really looking forward to maintaining the kind of the rigor and the collaborations and the motivation that the community has given me to go this long. And I'm particularly looking forward to taking all of that to the Centre for Social Impact, which has very, very similar philosophies and principles, which is one of the reasons why, after 10 years of ARCSHS, I've decided that if I was going to move anywhere, then that was where I'd be prepared to move to. So I look forward to continuing to work with everyone.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm very sorry we can't go to the pub and or a bar and really give Graham the toast he deserves, but perhaps we'll all be lucky enough to be invited when we can see people in the flesh again.
That'd be wonderful.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The next seminar is on September 16th. If you'd like to join us, the details of the seminar are up on the ARCSHS website. Thank you, bye.